Well, good afternoon, everyone. There are 4 days left on the parliamentary calendar before the House rises for the summer, and Justin Trudeau is going to burn 2 of those days, and Mark Holland is House Leader, on an unjustified and unnecessary extension of hybrid parliament motion. Rather than using the time to address the cost of living crisis that Canadians are facing, the Liberals are going to set up a parliament in a way that suits them. And when the Liberals talk about a hybrid parliament, what they're really talking about is setting up a parliament where they can be less accountable. In the hybrid parliament, ministers don't have to walk through the media scrums to get to the House. It's a great way of avoiding reporters' questions. It's also a great way to avoid opposition scrutiny as well. You don't need to look further than the Heritage Committee and their handling of Bill C-11. Hetty Fry chaired the entire study of the bill from her home in Vancouver. She refused to come to Ottawa to stick-handle this critical bill through committee. Instead, she muddled her way through more than 100 amendments. At many points, the committee fell into chaos and disorder because of an over-reliance on hybrid parliament. Just last week, there was a vote on a private member's bill in the House. Mid-vote, the voting app crashed. Imagine if that had been a confidence vote, a vote of great importance in this country, and the chaos that would have ensued. What's more is that hybrid parliament has caused a 9-fold increase in our interpreters and is putting our bilingual parliament at risk. Under hybrid parliament, committee resources are more limited, leading to more canceled meetings on important topics like medical assistance in dying and the invocation of the Emergencies Act through the Emergencies Act Committee. These kinds of circumstances are contributing to a decline in our democracy, and it's time for these hybrid tools to be put back in the box and to look for ways to strengthen our democracy, not to diminish it. I'll be happy to take your questions now.
We'll start with questions in the room. For reporters online, please use the raise hand function to ask your questions.
Hi, Mr. Brassard. Rachel Aiello, CTV News.
Rachel?
Fair to say the Conservatives are going to be resisting this, but it seems that the NDP are on side. Is there anything the Conservatives can do to stop this hybrid motion from passing?
Actually, not if the NDP are signaling, Rachel, that they are going to be supporting the government on this. About 2 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago, I sent a letter to Mark Holland that was circulated to all of the other House leaders. I thought we made some reasonable and practical suggestions in a return to Parliament normalcy in the fall. Obviously, the NDP, by signaling that they're going to be supporting this motion with the government, doesn't support those. It's time that we get back to some sense of normalcy around here. Every other Canadian, businesses are moving. Legislatures across the country are in person. There's no reason why the House of Commons can't return to in-person sitting in the fall.
And just on the timing of this, in the past with the hybrid, they had kind of considered it in the fall, depending on the health situation. Them going ahead and deciding now what it's going to look like in a couple months. I'm wondering if you had comments on that in the context of them saying in releasing the vaccine mandates, the public health situation is improving. So are you seeing a disconnect there between what they're deciding now with hybrid?
Well, I think you bring up a real important point, Rachel, is that we're not seeing any evidence and we're not seeing any science at all that indicates that they have to move to this hybrid session, or at least propose to continue it into the fall. Through our House Leader meetings, we've had these type of discussions, and on the heels of the letter that we sent, these discussions have happened. And Mark and Peter both have said that somehow they believe that there's a new variant that's going to be coming in the fall. Simple answer to that, or simple solution, is to provide us with the evidence that suggests that. So far, we have received nothing. The fact is, as you said, that there continues to be ongoing efforts to eliminate some of the mandates. In fact, today in the House of Commons, all of the mandates have been lifted. We're seeing that broadly across the country. Public health authorities and agencies in all the provinces and territories are lifting those mandates. For them to preclude that somehow something's going to happen in the fall at this point, there's no reason, Rachel, why we cannot, if we need to, flip a switch if and when that time comes. Right now, for them to suggest that we're going to move forward with a hybrid parliament, when we're seeing this decline in democracy already happen, this lack of accountability in some of the examples that I cited earlier, but overall, the other thing that's happening, and this is not being talked about enough, is the amount of injuries that are happening to the Interpreter Bureau. We're seeing a decline in the health of our interpreters. There's no question. We've heard this at various committees, including PROC. We heard it at the BOIE, that interpreters are paying a big price for this hybrid parliament. We believe, and we suggested as we did a couple of weeks ago, that there is a way that we can get back to some sense of normalcy around here. We can certainly have a hybrid parliament, not have a hybrid parliament, but return to in-person seating. This is the seat of power. Every elected official in this country runs on the basis that they're going to have to come to Ottawa. If something happens in the fall, we can adjust, but why we're making this determination in the last week of Parliament is beyond me, and I think we should at least signal that we're going to get back to normal here in the fall. Thank you.
Press. The Liberal House Leader has committed that government members will be answering questions in person in question period under this extended hybrid parliament. The examples you cited were about issues around committees. So if the NDP is signaling that they are going to support the continuation of hybrid parliament, and that is a reality we're facing, will you try to negotiate that committee members appear in person to avoid the hiccups and the scenarios that you laid out as issues?
Thank you, Stephanie. I don't think there's any reason to negotiate anything. We signaled very clearly a couple of weeks ago in our letter to Mark Holland, which was circulated to the rest of the House leaders, including the Speaker of the House, that our intent and our want is to get back to a normal parliamentary session. That included committees as well. So there's no signaling or no negotiation, in my view, that needs to be had. One only has to look at the problems that it's created. I cited the recent example with the Heritage Committee, which effectively became a chaotic, as they were dealing with a very important piece of legislation, became very chaotic because the chair of the committee hasn't been to Ottawa, hasn't been in person. We're going to continue to see these types of things. We've seen it at other committees as well. But more importantly, Stephanie, what's happening is the interpreters are being injured as a result of this, and that's well documented. There's been reports that have been published. They've been presented to certain committees and the BOIE, and it's time that we get back to some sense of normalcy. So from my standpoint, there's no reason to negotiate whether committees get back into person, because they should be in person, just like the House of Commons should be in person.
We're in the last week of Parliament, as you cited, and your party is in the midst of a leadership race. We saw that Mr. Fast is no longer the finance critic because of comments he made related to one of the candidates. So I'm interested, from your perspective, how did he see your party's leadership race impact the work your party did in Parliament?
Well, you gotta understand the circumstances that we were dealt with. Shortly after the new leadership team, including Candace, our leader, took over, we were facing a situation where we saw a coalition agreement. I know they like to refer to it as a supply and confidence agreement between the NDP and the Liberals. That effectively gave Justin Trudeau and the Liberals the majority that they had hoped to get in September. That came with its own set of circumstances, Stephanie, in terms of, the official opposition was effectively being shut out. I know that Mark might have mentioned that there was continuing negotiations and discussions among the party. We were the last to hear about many of the things that were happening within the House of Commons, because the Liberals would just simply go to the NDP and say, this is what we want to do, and get their agreement on it. There's been 16 time allocation motions that have happened in the House of Commons. The NDP have supported the Liberals 95% of the time since the supply and confidence agreement kicked in. So it definitely, there's no question about it in my mind, changed the entire dynamics for our particular leadership team. Up until the supply and confidence agreement, there were many discussions that were going on within the party. After that, when the Liberals figured out that they didn't need the opposition, and I include the Bloc in that, where they effectively wanted an audience, not an opposition, then they would do an end around to the NDP. That's how it changed significantly the dynamics within the House of Commons over the last 4 months.
Hi, Stephanie Levis, the Toronto Star. You said you don't really know why it is that the Liberals want to introduce this motion now for hybrid parliament. And I wonder, whether you think it has something to do with your leadership race and a way to sort of, get your new leader, whoever they might be, off on an uncertain foot come September, because they won't be able to face off, let's say, in person against the Prime Minister, or puts committees into a bit of a mess. What do you think about that?
So what you're suggesting then, Stephanie, is that they're doing this purely for political reasons, when I'm suggesting that there's no reason to do it at all. The government should be signaling to Canadians that we are going to get back to some sense of normalcy here in Parliament, in the House of Commons. We've seen over the course of the last several months, legislatures in provinces and territories getting back to normal, in-person sitting, not utilizing hybrid. There's been international legislatures that have done the same thing. So there's no reason why we're not returning back to normal here. And if all they're doing it for is political reasons, to somehow, as they have been over the last several months, to poke Conservatives in the eye, this is not the way our Parliament is supposed to function. Our Parliament, the seat of power, constitutionally is here in Ottawa. Everyone who gets elected to Parliament understands their role and responsibility, and that's to be here, to stand up, to make themselves counted, and to have their vote counted as well. They need to be here.
Just a follow up on a broader question. I don't know if you would have seen it, but your colleague Charlie Angus wrote a piece in Policy Options where he talked about the challenges being put before him as an elected MP when he's confronted with folks in his riding or at other events who are really in the throes of a lot of the conspiracy theories we see out there right now, and how that not that it concerns him, but it makes it difficult. It makes it difficult to speak to people. It makes it difficult. And I wonder if you just could speak a bit about your own experience with that. I know all MPs are being bombarded with this sort of thing in their constituent offices and elsewhere. What that's been like for you, and how you see it posing a challenge to the broader work of parliamentarians.
I didn't see Charlie's article, but I can certainly speak to the point that you're talking about, Steph. There is a tremendous amount of anxiety in this country and anxiousness. The affordability issue is having a tremendous impact on not just my residents in Barrie Innisfil. I hear from them every day about the impact high gas prices are having, grocery prices, making decisions about whether they put gas in their car or whether they eat. It's that serious of a situation. And I think, as legislators, as policymakers, we have to understand that this anxiety is real. We can't just sit here in the bubble of Ottawa and not think that the people that we're representing right across this country aren't being impacted by this. That's why Conservatives have put forward motions over the course of the last several weeks to try to make life more affordable for people, to lower gas taxes, to get rid of the carbon tax, just measures that would help with the affordability and inflationary crisis that's going on right now. So when you look at people and the level of anxiety, seniors, businesses, there's not a day that goes by that I don't receive emails from people who are struggling every single day. So I'm not surprised that there's this level of anger that's out there. I'm certainly hearing it in my riding. Just Saturday night, I was out at a public event and I was approached by a couple of people there who are saying they can't afford to put gas in their car. And if you live in a place like Barrie Innisfil and you work in Markham or Mississauga or Malton or Vaughan, every day you're traveling down the 400, it's $2.09 a liter in gas. So it's no surprise to me that people are angry. And instead of focusing on those inflation issues and the affordability issues, we're dealing with emotion over the next couple of days, using valuable time in real estate here in the House of Commons to deal with something hypothetically that may happen in the fall. Why aren't we dealing with the problems that are facing Canadians? That's the challenge that I have. And so when Charlie talks about this anger, focus the anger, understand where that anger is coming from. It's coming from people who can't afford day-to-day essentials in this country and are really being impacted by affordability and inflation.
Campbell Clark from the Globe and Mail. To go back to the hybrid parliament, if you speak to a constituent or somebody else or on the main streets of Canada, other than saying that this is a return to normalcy, how would you explain to them what the difference is when they say, what's the big deal about a hybrid parliament, about doing this over virtual networks and voting by pressing a button? How would you explain to them that there's a difference here?
I would say that there is a big difference. The big difference is in, first and foremost, Campbell, the understanding that when a member of parliament is elected to parliament, that they're expected to be in parliament, not just debate the issues, to show up at committee, but also to be there for their standing vote. The voting system, the app system, and the hybrid parliament only came about as a result of COVID. That's when it started. And I'll give full credit to House administration, the support staff for coming up with that system. But like everything else and everyone else, we're getting to a point where COVID is becoming an endemic. People are returning back to normal. Legislatures, not just here in Canada and the territories and the provinces, are getting back to normal. They're showing up in person. Legislatures around the world are doing the same thing. So I would say to people that it served its purpose. It served its function during COVID. And if anyone or any institution is to signal to Canadians that we're getting back to some sense of normalcy, it should be the House of Commons and Canada and Parliament. That's what I would say to them. The other thing I would say is that it hasn't functioned as entirely well as perhaps what the government House Leader and others are signaling. We've had chaos at committee. We've had a voting app collapse. We've had interpreters who've been damaged and injured as a result of the systems that are being used. It's not a perfect system. And those are things that we have to consider as well, Campbell, that we have to get back to some sense of normalcy. At a minimum, we have to signal that to Canadians, but more importantly, in order for this institution to function properly, that there is proper accountability, that there is proper transparency, and that there's no further erosion in the decline in democracy like we've seen as far as accountability and transparency. That's why we have to get back to normal.
From the idea of signaling a return to normalcy, how would you tell somebody, and again, aside from the idea of returning to normalcy and we don't need this anymore, what are they losing in terms of governance and accountability? Can you show them an example of something that Canadians won't be well served by, or something that they had before hybrid parliaments that they are losing now?
Well, I can speak specifically, Campbell, to Motion 11. And I don't know if you recall when Motion 11 came out, the idea was that it gave the government powers to extend beyond the normal hours. There weren't going to be any dilatory motions, no quorum calls. If you notice through the debates on Motion 11, when the government has extended, and you may see it tonight, you may see it tomorrow night as well, there has been zero accountability. There's only been a couple of Liberals that have been showing up in the House of Commons. And this is the very argument that I made against Motion 11 at the time, was that it wasn't going to provide accountability. There wasn't going to be proper debate.
Why is it important that they're there, though, to your constituents?
Well, it's important because that's what Parliament is. It's a debating place, Campbell, where ideas are exchanged. It's called Parliament, parle. We speak, we talk. We try to make bills better. We try to make legislation better. We try to make policy better for Canadians. And so it's important that people are here. Now, when I go back to Motion 11, as I was saying, what we found under Motion 11, even when we're here late into the evening, and you'll notice this if you go back, and you may notice it over the next couple of days, Conservatives are debating Conservatives. The Liberals aren't putting up any speakers. The NDP aren't putting up any speakers. Conservatives are asking questions of Conservatives. That's not the way this place functions. This place functions because there's an opposition, not an audience, to the government. And when we go back to the September 20th election, Canadians sent Justin Trudeau here in a minority situation. They didn't send him here to be a majority government. And now with the NDP and the supply and confidence agreement, I call it a coalition government, Justin Trudeau's got effectively what he wants, and that is a majority government. But, this is a minority situation. It's not functioning in the manner in which it should. And having MPs in this place debating, standing up and having their vote counted is critical to not just this institution, but the way our parliamentary democracy functions. Thank you. Thanks, Campbell.
We will take a question online from Ryan Tumulty. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Brassard. Mr. Holland, when he announced this, was talking about the value that comes from people being able to report, to participate remotely. There were 5 MPs, I guess, last week who had COVID, who could participate because of this system. He also, also in the history of the Commons, there have been MPs who have been, taken from their hospital bed to the chamber to be able to participate. Do you think there is some value at all in keeping some of the hybrid provisions?
Ryan, thanks for the question. One of the things in the letter that we sent a couple of weeks ago was options that are already existing within the standing orders that include the possibility, for example, of pairing. I also believe that there are some ways to help not disenfranchise members of parliament when they are facing situations like the ones you described. Look, I'm empathetic, I'm sympathetic. I know that there are examples. I've been here for 7 years where members have become ill or have been dealing with family situations. I think there's an opportunity for us to work together to find out what some of those solutions are so that those members can effectively represent their constituents. Many of them who've been elected, they fall ill while they're elected. They should be able to do their job. So we proposed using already existing standing orders rules to make sure that happens. If there is an opportunity, for example, where we could use the voting app or a hybrid parliament to look after those people who have fallen ill or looking after a family, then that's an option that's available to us. My preference is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to rewrite existing standing orders when they already exist for members to participate in the House. I met with the Speaker a couple of weeks ago to talk about the letter that I had sent, and I said to the Speaker clearly, I said, look, we understand that there are circumstances and situations that people go through in life, whether it's illness or injury or dealing with family situations. We want to make sure that we're looking after those people as well, those members of Parliament who are elected here who can continue to do their job. So I'm not adverse to that, but what I don't like, Ryan, frankly, is the government signaling that this is the way it's going to be because of the partnership agreement that they have with the NDP. If there is room for negotiation, then I'm prepared to talk to Mr. Holland about that. In fact, Mark and I spoke this morning, and we're preparing some things that we think are going to make the motion better. But what we're not prepared for a motion, not just a motion, but to help not disenfranchise those members of Parliament. But what I'm not prepared for is to agree to the extension of a hybrid Parliament in the absence of any evidence, any science going forward in the fall. If there's a need for us to return to a hybrid, if somehow there is some new variant that is causing chaos, not just in this country, but around the world, and we need to flip the switch. We've proven over the last couple of years that that can happen, and I don't think it needs to happen in the final week that Parliament is sitting, Ryan.
And then just as a follow-up, Mr. Holland also accused your caucus this morning of using delay tactics throughout the spring sitting, basically saying that it wasn't enough for your caucus to vote against certain bills, but that you also sought actively to delay them. I'm wondering if you've got any response to that.
Well, the ultimate delay tactic, Ryan, was proroguing Parliament and calling an election that was unnecessary. After just 18 months of being in a minority situation, the government last September had every opportunity to push forward its legislative agenda by not calling an unnecessary and unwanted election. And I'll remind you of something that I said earlier, Ryan, and that is that, Trudeau received a minority government. He didn't receive a majority government. Canadians sent him here to be held accountable and to be transparent to the opposition party. In fact, the Conservative Party, as Her Majesty's loyal opposition, has been using every tool that we can to make sure that the government is held to account. Motion 11, as I mentioned earlier, was a hammer on this Parliament, which effectively seized control of Parliament, using the NDP as their partners, so that we certainly couldn't propose or promote any good ideas in this Parliament. Time allocation has been done 16 times in this place. The NDP have voted with the Liberals 95% of the time since this new session and this new coalition agreement has taken place. So I'm not going to apologize for doing our job as an opposition. I know the Prime Minister would have liked an audience in the opposition, but what we were doing was making sure that he had an opposition, even if the NDP wasn't going to fulfill their obligations.
Last question, Junior Kestrel.
Merci.
Me again, John. I just wanted to go back to the second question I asked you, because what I was referring to, maybe I wasn't clear enough, was Charlie was writing about conspiracy theories.
Okay.
And the extent to which he hears from constituents who believe quite strongly in conspiracy theories about the World Economic Forum, about all sorts of things, and that he's struggling as a parliamentarian to figure out how to engage in that scenario, and the extent to which his office gets bombarded with calls or the pushback there. And I just was hoping you would reflect on that element of it and the way in which we're seeing this sort of mis and disinformation permeate into our political culture, and what your experience has been.
Yeah, I wouldn't say, Stephanie, that it's just coming from one side of the political spectrum. I think it feeds into the overall anger and anxiety that people are having. Over the last couple of years, for example, people have been locked down with COVID. There's been lots of opportunities to engage and interact online and on the internet. I would say that the best way to deal with that, as I have many times, is to actually call people up and answer their questions in a forthright and truthful way. Oftentimes people are speculating because of what they read online, or perhaps what they hear in a third-party forum. So, the best way for Charlie and the best way for me to engage in those, and every one of us who are members of Parliament, is to talk to people and let them know what is actually going on here in Ottawa. And there is a lot of things that are people are looking at, but again, feeding into this anger and this anxiety, a lot of things that I talked about earlier about the affordability crisis, people are they feel hopeless. They feel like, they're not being listened to here in Ottawa. And we need to do, all of us, Charlie, myself, and others, need to work on unifying the country and not dividing it. I think that's critical. Canada, we're facing some very significant challenges right now, the magnitude of which probably hasn't been dealt with for many generations. The only way that we're going to deal with this, Stephanie, is that if we work on things in a united way, united fashion. The countries are divided along regional lines, many different lines. And it's up to us, it's incumbent on all of us as leaders in this country to make sure that we're working to give people hope, because I can tell you, in my riding and what I'm hearing from around the country, people are starting to lose hope, and they're feeling overwhelmed with this level of anxiety and the affordability crisis that they're facing. And I'm sure that I'm not the only one hearing it. I'm sure there are Liberal members, NDP bloc members, they're all hearing the same thing. And it's easy for us to sit here in Ottawa and not understand what's going on outside this country. I can tell you there is concern, anxiety, and fear among many Canadians, and we better do a better job at addressing that. Okay, thanks. Thank you,
This
everyone.
concludes the press conference. Thank you.